My name is Steve Guggenheimer. I joined Microsoft, I believe, October 18th, 1993, and I left Microsoft in September of 2020. I had a pretty good run for 27 plus years, a variety of roles, mostly sort of bridging technology and customers and partners. I've got a physics background, but I'm not a coder by trade. So was able to translate. So worked on product teams, worked on segment teams, ultimately became a corporate vice president, ran both our hardware and our software ecosystems, and finished up doing a little work on AI. I was born in Massachusetts, but I only lived there till I was 2, and then lived overseas for 4 years. My dad was in the military. So I had what I call the impressionable years, junior high and high school in Southern California. Went to university in Northern California, took my first job at a laser company, and went to grad school part-time, where I ultimately ran into a gentleman named James Blumenthal doing a case study on Microsoft. And that landed me in the state of Washington in 1993. The funny thing I tell the kids today when I speak at schools, if you had asked me when I was in high school, if I'd end up living in Washington or working for Microsoft, well, there really wasn't a Microsoft. Never thought about living somewhere else or overseas for work or for all the other things that sort of occurred in life. So you never know at that younger age where you're going to end up. I think my life, as everybody's, has been mostly a journey. And that starts in school. When I was applying for colleges, there was no internet, there was no online. So you kind of went to the college fair and you looked at brochures. I applied to UC Davis for an engineering degree. And primarily I did well in math. I kind of like science. And then and my dad was a double E. So I applied for that. I didn't get in. The school was impacted at some GPA I didn't have. But they said these other degrees are open, and one of them was physics. So I was like, great, I liked physics class. And so I not thinking too far ahead, I signed up for physics at UC Davis, and off I went. I got into the degree I could get into, and I got out in 4 years. And when you hit your junior year, you're like, well, what do you actually do with this? The truth is most physics majors go on to grad school because that's kind of what they encourage you to do. It's either that or a nuclear submarine. I wasn't super excited for either of those. Fortunately, I'd had an internship. I kind of worked my way through college, and I'd had an internship at Lawrence Livermore Labs. I worked on some lasers that were manufactured by a company called Spectrophysics Lasers, which is ultimately where I wanted to work. And so I managed to get into that company about a year after I got out of university. I worked in a physics contracting firm, essentially in the interim. And that was the beginning of the journey. I was pretty fortunate while I was working there. They had a program that HP had actually started where you could go to graduate school part-time. And so I actually went over to Stanford part-time, went from work every day over to Stanford, and worked on getting my master's degree. It took about 3 years to get a 1-year degree, but I was able to do that and work full-time at the laser company. And again, that's part of the journey on the way to Microsoft. I was at grad school at Stanford, and we were doing case studies. And we did a case study on Microsoft. And Jabe flew down for the day to listen to each of the groups in the class present their sort of view on the case study and their solution to the case study. And that was fun. And then we all went and had lunch. So we sat around a table outside and had lunch. So I sat at the table with Jabe. And it turns out it was towards the end of the year, that was the final project. And I was going up to Washington in the summer to visit my roommate from Davis, who was living there at the time. And so I said, hey, Jabe, I'm going to be in Washington this summer. I'd love to get a tour of Microsoft. That was my I was curious, what the campus looked like. And Jabe said, sure. And, over time, we traded some notes back and forth. So the next thing I know, when I'm heading up to Washington, I'm set up to see him. And I should say about halfway up the drive to Washington, I get this note that says, well, if you're going to be here, why don't you interview? And I was like, well, that sounds like a great idea. Though I had I'm in Oregon, haven't done any prep work. And I'm like, I guess I should do some studying on Microsoft because I really didn't know the company that well at the time. And there wasn't today you look online, you understand what the process is like. There was none of that. So I kind of show up, I've got some stuff that I worked on, I had with me, and I'm ready for the interview. And And my wife drops me off at campus, and they tell you you're going to be done at noon. So I'm like, hey, come pick me up at noon, and there's at the guard gate or where we were at the time, and I start the interview process, and it's challenging, as they say. You get all kinds of different questions, and it's funny because I thought, oh, they want to talk about my background, marketing or physics, whatever. We spend zero time on that and all these abstract questions. And so the day keeps going, and I spent the morning with the consumer group, which is where Jade was at. And then in the middle of the day, not knowing what's going on in the background, I get sent over to the Windows team, and I spent my afternoon with the Windows team. Well, the first thing that occurs is my wife comes back at noon to get me. There's no cell phones in those days, and I don't show up. And quite honestly, she was getting pretty frustrated because I'm not coming out. And finally, the security folks were able to, tell her he's still interviewing. And she ended up sitting out there for about 4 or 5 hours, not knowing what's going on. And long story short, 6 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, I think I had an offer. And 3 weeks after that, we were moving up. I was working with partners. I did most of my career with, not most, a decent amount of my career with partners. So in those days, there was something called solution providers and solution developers. I was on the Windows for Workgroups team. So we were working on Windows for Workgroups 3.1, Project Snowball. About a month to ship. I landed in October, and I started working on materials for the partner groups. So I was, again, working on the marketing / sales / whatever materials were relevant for the partner ecosystem. I remember I landed, in October, whatever it was, 18th or so. And November, I was off at Comdex working in the booth and busy using the software, learning how to use Schedule Plus, doing more email, and starting to develop materials, materials to be used by partners at that time for Windows for Workgroups 3.1. The first few days at Microsoft, obviously, you're pretty nervous. It's like in a completely different world. I'm trying to figure out a little bit what your job is, and then trying to learn the product and technology at the same time as trying to figure out what your job is. And Microsoft was moving fast at that time. There was still an MS-DOS team floating around where Windows 95 hadn't kicked off yet. It was really getting a feel for being in a bigger company, the pace and amount of work that was going on, and just finding your way around, getting your feet underneath you. The nice thing about Windows for Workgroups, that project, is it ended, not too long after I got there, and we rolled off immediately to Windows 95. And so I was on the ground from day one with Windows 95, which was, as many people know, a sort of a turning point project for Microsoft. And that was, an incredible year and a half, 2 years. Chicago was the code name. I was doing all kinds of stuff on the, again, slightly the technical side of marketing. We wrote a Windows 95 resource kit, myself and Brent Ethington and others worked on that, Yusuf and Keith White. And we built something called the Windows 95 preview program, where we essentially got early builds out to hundreds of thousands of IT professionals, got a system put together, got them to pay for it, as part of the preview program. We did Windows 95 tours. It was, we'd come in every weekend, there would be, the developers were all there. We were, a lot of us were there, working, head to the cafeteria for lunch. It was an incredible period of time, both in terms of work intensity, work output, and then, what was ultimately delivered. We were working on Windows 95. I didn't have as much of a sense. I hadn't been in the computer industry that long, obviously, of what a changing or turning point it would be for the PC market. You don't know when you're in the middle of it. You can only look backwards and say, wow, the impact of that was bigger than you thought when you were working on it, and more memorable. As experiences go, that was sort of one of the most unique teams and one of the best sort of training ground for me in terms of everything about how not just the company operated, but how the ecosystem, the OEMs and the ISVs operated, and then sort of how to build and ship software at scale. Windows 95 was a piece of a puzzle at the time, because at the same time Windows NT was being built, and Office 95 was being built. So 95 got a lot of the play because we did a little tree. It was a little bit more of the end user system, but NT, we're busy going after the corporate side as well, and ultimately Windows NT Server and NetWare. So I think the model was similar, but what you find over time in terms of shipping large-scale software is there were more teams doing it. Office and Windows were the big teams at that time, but then we flowed into Internet Explorer. The Windows NT team picked up. There were other server products coming along. They started working on Exchange. So I think it was a a very strong model for what occurred over time. But that one was a little bit unique because it was just the scale and the focus, and then just the buzz that occurred on the consumer side. I think the next closest consumer buzz was Xbox. One of the things that I got from the Windows 95 team or learned or you're exposed to was speaking and demoing. For whatever reason, it's not anything I ever studied, but I did okay at doing demos, and we started doing these Windows 95 world tours, big theaters with people in them, and there's funny stories about demos, but that became a part of sort of my persona over time. Is I ended up doing demos, and then I ended up doing demos for Bill and for Steve and for Jim Alchin and for other execs, Paul Moritz. And so there was in the early part of my career, I was just sort of the demo person working along with the executives. And so you build demos and you'd work on, and you'd learn the product, and you do a ton of that. And ultimately, somewhere along the line, that transitioned into not being the demoer, but being the speaker. And then over time, my last 10 years at Microsoft, I did a lot of keynote speeches. Somewhere I have, hundreds of badges from all the talks that I gave. I did a lot of EBCs. Super, super interesting. It's something I still do today, in other venues. And it's a great piece of the opportunity, I got at Microsoft, or many of us had at Microsoft, which is to be a spokesperson, to do PR, to do on stage. And, it's scary at times, and there's a lot of learning to do, but the ability to connect the products that we built and the technologies with different audiences, through storytelling and through demonstrations and through trying to connect with the audience was awesome. And a lot of sort of the early part of my career, how I met other people and how you end up sort of, broadening your network was by being backstage at big events. Yeah, one of my roles was running the OEM business, which was a super interesting one. It's a very large part of the company at the time, and it's very dependent on the number of PCs that ship, and then having the legal windows on it. And you end up in instead of a big conversation with a lot of people, you often end up in a big conversation relative to the impact with a few people, the heads of Dell, HP, Lenovo, Acer, Asus, Compal, Quanta, Inventec, Samsung, LG, etc. There's a real balance between what the new version of Windows or any of the technologies we're building would do in conjunction with their hardware, what the pricing is, because pricing is obviously a key component of that, what all of the tools are that are used that go along with pricing in terms of incentives. We were regulated at the time, so I managed the Windows business when it was still regulated coming out of the DOJ. So those conversations were very different. They were very sort of high impact, back and forth. And of course, if they didn't like the answer, they're going to either go to Kevin Turner at the time or Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer knew that business inside and out, especially the numbers. So I worked hard on the relationship side, having very good relationships with the OEMs, working with them, trying to find the best balance between their objectives and our objectives. And those were much less, I'll say, evangelical conversations and much more business conversations that aligned with sort of win-win between the technologies we were building and the technologies they were building, and ultimately our end customers. So my journey through Microsoft was not a straight line, but a ton of fun. I always wanted to be sort of in the center of the whirlwind, wherever the action was. And I learned that coming out of Windows 95, because that certainly was center of the whirlwind. And I went straight from 95, like the week after we shipped, I think I was, product manager number 1 or 2 on Internet Explorer, and myself and Yusuf and a bunch of other people, went into IE and IE2, IE3, IE4. So did Internet Explorer for a while. Ended up on Windows 98, Windows Millennium Edition. So sort of stayed on that side of the house for a while. But then ended up, there was a gentleman named Rick Belluzzo that was a COO that had been brought in, and I ended up going to be his business manager. And that sort of broadened my perspective on a whole bunch of other parts of the business. Ended up doing work on the consumer side. So MSN for a while, and MSN International with Moshe Lichtman. And then again, working for Rick, They were launching Xbox, and then Bob Muglia came along. We started working on .NET. Hailstorm was the code name there, and so there was a whole bunch of pieces that sat under Rick Belluzzo. And then as the business manager, I worked on, and I did some consumer strategy work, trying to link all the pieces together. Went to CES, did the booth of the CES, did the keynotes, and then Rick left. And when Rick left, an opportunity came up in the UK to work on customer and partner experience. We'd gotten sort of low scores on CPE, NSAT, net satisfaction. And so the UK needed some help. They sent me over, which was a great experience. I got a year in the UK to work on that. And then Orlando Ayala, who'd sent me over there, and I think he was running sales at the time, asked me to come back and work on small business and sort of operations for SMSMP. So I got to work on, that was kind of the shift from product. From product, I did consumer strategy. That was strategy. And then from that one, I did small business strategy. From small business sort of strategy and that work, I ended up in the server group doing application platform work, which was developer tools, BizTalk, and SQL Server. And again, kind of a strategy for developers, linked into evangelism a little bit there. And then that's when I got promoted into corporate vice president and ended up running ecosystem. So I did OEM from there for 5 years. I did developer experience, which was developer evangelism and ISV for 4 or 5 years. And then the last couple of years doing some partner work for the MBS ecosystem and AI. And so it was quite the journey, not a straight line. Super interesting. I always, told people it, in Silicon Valley, people went to lots of different companies to have different audiences and products. At Microsoft, you could work on anything from consumer to commercial, from small business and consumer all the way up to enterprise, a variety of products with one common thread called software. And so we're very fortunate. I had the opportunity to work on just a huge variety of things without ever having to leave sort of the Microsoft umbrella. In the early days of starting to build the infrastructure as a service model relative to our Windows Server model, there were some tough meetings with Bill and Steve and the engineering teams around this is the hailstorm time frame and post hailstorm when we're working on the early cloud infrastructure, stuff that was being done and being tough internal conversations. Those conversations, in some ways were tough, but a really small group. The next group inside of Microsoft ends up being the Salesforce, and getting the Salesforce model shifted, getting the way we incent people and the compensation models changed, and getting people balanced between selling the old Windows Server Cal and Sal licenses and selling the new SaaS licenses, and knowing you're going to shift from one to the other, but you can't sunset the first one until the other side picks up. Those were incredibly hard and long, multi-year journeys of transformation. And they were fun to be a part of. I learned a ton. Anytime I talk to a customer or somebody I work with today, I can look back on those transitions that we made as learning for how other companies and industries should think about their transitions. As much fun and challenge as sort of the internal shifts and changes were with each of the paradigm shifts, the ecosystem shifts were actually harder because the partner models, when you move from a Cal-Sal model to a SaaS model, they change. They're how much they make because we're now running the back end infrastructure. So their incentive model, it changes, and not everybody makes it through that. And also the skills requirement changes. The who you compete with versus who you partner with, that changes. And so there's a new set of partners that you have to work with. The OEMs and the ISVs, the ecosystems, that part's all shifting, and it they're shifting with the paradigm. So you kind of have you have good control on the engineering side, making those changes internally. You have pretty good control on your field side. You can pull those levers. When you're changing the ecosystem, it's much harder. And there were times when Steve had to get on stage and sort of say, look, the world is moving to this software as a service model. It means changes for the partner ecosystem. Not everybody's going to love these changes, but we are going to make them, and we're going to lead from the front on this. You have to tell the street when you're doing your earnings how you should be measured. in a software as a service world as opposed to being measured in a Cal-Sal world. So Amy has to, explain to people, how they should think about Microsoft and view us. So the broader the circle goes, from the engineering building a new sort of platform model to the Microsoft overall selling that model to getting the ecosystem and everybody that's involved from the street to the ISVs to startups to OEMs to everyone else, the complexity just continues to increase, and your storytelling has to get better and better about where the new world is and where it's going. We are fortunate to work on and with a set of technology that isn't limited, to a certain geographic area or certain size business or certain, class or, place in life. It's technology that has impact everywhere. And so, that is an amazing sort of opportunity, but also responsibility. And, you want to think and believe that the company has done the best it can in terms of using and enabling that technology for the good of the people in the world. I was in a group with Gurdeep and Harry's world working on solutions. How do you actually build solutions that are specifically built using AI for different business processes? That ultimately ended up in MBS. The product groups were busy taking the building blocks and some of their own work and infusing AI into their products. And so as a company, we started working on a story around, what does Microsoft do? Well, Microsoft is building core building blocks that the industry as a whole can use. Microsoft is infusing AI into our core products, whether it's Windows or Office or, any of the tool sets. And we're working on some new solution side. How do you put it into business solutions with sort of the MBS side? And that framing of that story, some of the early work that was done on the technology side and with partners, ended up becoming a little bit of a life of its own, because telling that story and trying to piece it together, we had a weekly meeting with Satya for the last, for 2 or 3 of the years in the middle there, specifically going through all the parts of the AI. And it was shaping the conversation both inside and outside. And there was enough learning from sort of how IE went from being, or sort of how the internet went from being this separate thing to being just part of the fabric of everything we did. And sort of taking that thinking in terms of AI, how it goes from, on one hand, having a life of its own, on the other, being woven into the fabric of everything, that's going on at the company. And I think we had the hindsight of the knowledge from having gone through these paradigm shifts. And now, we're on the other side of that, where it's becoming part of all of the conversations at Microsoft, versus sort of in the early days, there was just a few of us, telling that story. And then, a chunk of people doing deep work where in today's world, everybody's got a part of that. The industry's gone through incredible changes. I always, when I talk to people today, when we grew up sort of there, we had 3 building blocks: compute, storage, networking. We just wanted more compute power, 286 to 386, 386 to 486, depending, et cetera. More, networking, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, DSL at home, fiber, et cetera, and more storage. The kids coming out of school today have a different set of building blocks. They have AI, they have artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, they have mixed reality, they have blockchain, they ultimately will have quantum. And so they have a whole new set of building blocks. They're starting from a whole new place. But if you think about in 25 years with that set of building blocks, the number of changes that occurred going from client to client server computing to the internet and weaving that into, as you noted, services as a way of operating, and now sort of AI on the and some of the other experiences. We've moved through these paradigms of the way the platforms and software are built, the way they're used, the experiences you can build on top of them. As a result, the number of devices that people have, the way media and content are moved around and used. I mean, the world has evolved at an incredible pace, and it hasn't slowed down, and it's not slowing down. And it's pretty amazing to be part of a company that's been in the center of that. And actually, I was fortunate to work on projects that sort of went through each of those evolutions. So pretty, there's not a more unique place to be for the last 25 years from a work environment, I think, than right at the heart of it.